So we are picking back up in the almost end of chapter 22 after we heard Paul speaking to the crowd after he was allowed to by the Roman tribune. And then they got all stirred up. They were listening to him for a while, but then they got all stirred up again when he mentioned about preaching to the Gentiles. And then they remembered why they had him up there in the first place. And so then the tribune decided to have Paul examined by flogging. But then Paul whipped out his, well, not actually whipped it out, but pulled out that Roman citizen card and was like, hey, I'm a Roman citizen, you can't do this. And everyone just backed off from doing anything to him. So we pick back up at verse 30 of chapter 22. But on the next day, desiring to know the real reason why he was being accused by the Jews, he, that being the tribune, unbounded him, being Paul, and commanded the chief priests and all the council to meet. And he brought Paul down and set him before them. Then chapter 23, verse 1. Looking intently at the council, Paul said, Brothers, I have lived my life before God in all good conscience up to this day. And the high priest, Ananias, commanded those who stood by him to strike him on the mouth. Then Paul said to him, God is going to strike you, you whitewashed wall. Are you sitting to judge me according to the law, and yet contrary to the law, you order me to be struck? I can't help but laugh at what Paul calls the high priest there, you whitewashed wall. Because you figure that idea of the whitewashed wall, that exterior that Ananias is using hides the fact that he is doomed to God's judgment. Yeah, it's just humorous when you read that of what Paul says to Ananias. And it's interesting when in verse 1, Paul is declaring his innocence, he is then struck. Can we pinpoint another event where a similar situation occurs?
Yeah, when our Lord and Savior was before the high priest, the night before his crucifixion, he was struck by I forget who struck him, one of the soldiers.
Yep. Absolutely right. Yep. So that is very similar to when Jesus was before the high priest. Now, the high priest at that point was that Annas or Caiaphas?
Well, they took Jesus to Annas first, and he had been the high priest, and he was retired. Gotcha. And Caiaphas took over then.
Okay.
But I imagine it was out of courtesy. They went to Ananias first.
Right.
And then to Caiaphas, yeah.
Yeah.
I said Ananias. I'm not sure I'm saying that right.
Right, yeah, because the one here is listed as Ananias, but then back in the Gospels and in toward the beginning of Acts, we still have, well, I guess it's more in the Gospels, Annas is referenced.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Yeah.
Not Ananias, but Annas. Yeah.
Oh my goodness, so many names that are of similar nature in the Bible. It's crazy. But yeah, and this is the third Ananias that we come across in the book of Acts. Of course, we remember the first one did not have a good heart, and he was struck dead after he lied about the share of the inheritance that he sold off. The second Ananias we mentioned last week a little bit, of course, when we talked about chapter 9, was the one who was sent to give Saul his sight and then baptize him. So this is the third Ananias that we come across here. And this Ananias is not necessarily the best of men. He, according to what I've read, we don't really know a lot about him other than the fact that he was cruel and he was despised. And he was actually assassinated by the Sicarii And I looked that up, and that they are Jewish revolutionaries who expected a messianic king and supported a revolt against the Romans in AD 66. So basically similar to, if not the same as, zealots. So, and notice what Paul says beyond just his whitewashed wall remark here. He says, God is going to strike you. So you kind of wonder, is he prophesying Ananias's demise, or is he just simply cursing him? But it definitely seems like Paul could be prophesying that. Of course, we're not exactly sure about that. And I'm not sure I totally want to go down that path if we're not 100% sure on that. But that's something that is very possible there. All right.
Well, I'm kind of glad that this is in the Bible. You know, there might have been a tendency for Luke, who wrote the book of Acts, to not say anything bad about Paul, but this shows that he was very human, and he lost his cool for just a moment there.
Yeah.
And we can all understand that, because he was innocent, and you know, he wondered, how much do I have to take? But then he backed off and said he didn't realize what he had done. So
Yep, absolutely. So then moving on with verse 4. Those who stood by said, would you revile God's high priest? And Paul said, I did not know, brothers, that he was the high priest. For it is written, you shall not speak evil of a ruler of your people. That is something that is given to the people, to the Israelites after the Ten Commandments. One of the commands that is given to them. Verse 6. Now when Paul perceived that one part were Sadducees and the other Pharisees, he cried out in the council, brothers, I am a Pharisee, a son of Pharisees. It is with respect to the hope and the resurrection of the dead that I am on trial. And when he had said this, a dissension rose between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. For the Sadducees say that there is no resurrection, nor angel, nor spirit, but the Pharisees acknowledge them all. Then a great clamor arose, and some of the scribes of the Pharisees' party stood up and contended sharply, we find nothing wrong in this man. What if a spirit or an angel spoke to him? And when the dissension became violent, the tribune, afraid that Paul would be torn to pieces by them, commanded the soldiers to go down and take him away from among them by force and bring him into the barracks. So it really seems like Paul is intentionally stirring up trouble here, because notice the phrase that he uses, which gets the disagreement stirred up. And that, of course, is resurrection of the dead. This is something that the Sadducees do not believe in, as Luke describes for us here. So that's the reason that the disagreement exists, because the Sadducees are included in this council and they do not believe in a resurrection from the dead. And of course, the Pharisees do, and thus this dissension or this disagreement kicks up.
Yeah, it's not the only time that Paul used that weapon. Later on, when he had been sent on to the governors Felix and Festus, and then his accusers came from Jerusalem to Caesarea, Paul brought up the resurrection again, because he knew that was something that would divide his accusers. And I'm just trying to think of that passage in the Gospels. Somebody help me out here. Remember that passage where the Sadducees came to Jesus and asked about the resurrection, and it said they really didn't believe in it, and so they thought they had a good issue there.
Yeah.
And so they posed that question, that this man he died without having any children. And so his brother took his wife and he died without having any children. Another brother married her. By the way, the reason the brothers did this, that was according to the law of the Old Testament. They were required to do that. But the point is, none of them had any children. And so their question was, in the resurrection, whose wife is she gonna be?
Right.
She would have been married to 7 different men, 6 or 7. Of course, they were doing this just to ensnare Jesus, because they didn't really believe in the resurrection to begin with. And that's in the gospel somewhere. I can't pinpoint the exact place, but again, that was the Sadducees. Yeah.
Trying to see. I'm looking through here. That was in the wrong chapter there. Hold on just a second. Here we go. Matthew chapter 22, beginning at verse 23 is where that's found.
Yes. The same day the Sadducees came to him who say there is no resurrection, and they ask him a question. Then they pose this idea that this man died without having children and so forth. By the way, that just something about being a pastor. I once called on a young couple who had just gotten married. They were very much in love, and they asked me, they said, "Pastor, is there really a passage like that in the Bible, that there's no marriage in heaven?" And I said, "Well, I'm afraid there is." And they were kind of sad about that. But that, if you go back to that passage in Matthew, that's how Jesus answered their question. He said, "You are in error. You don't realize that in heaven, there is no marriage as we know it here on earth." Right. Anyway, this couple I was visiting, they took that as really bad news. They had just gotten married.
Oh, goodness. Yeah. It's interesting, the things we cannot begin to fathom, begin to imagine once we get to the life of the world to come.
Well, that's just it. There's so much about heaven we don't understand, but we won't be disappointed.
Right, absolutely. And it's interesting how the scribes of the Pharisees are the ones who say that there's nothing wrong with what Paul is saying, and they're giving that possibility that he could have been spoken to by an angel or some other supernatural means. And then, of course, the Tribune sees how things are getting ugly, and he's worried about Paul's safety all over again. So he yanks him out and brings him back to the barracks, back to safety. Notice here in verse 11 what happens. The following night, the Lord stood by him and said, "Take courage, for as you have testified to the fact about me in Jerusalem, so you must testify also in Rome." Now, whether this was a vision that Paul had, or if this was an actual physical appearance by Jesus to him, we're not exactly sure. But what is said is that Paul has been talking, we've been talking about Paul's end goal being Rome. He really wants to get to Rome. Now, these words of Christ say that Paul must go to Rome. That is what is now being told to Paul by Christ himself, is that he must go to Rome. So it's interesting seeing all these different occasions when Paul talks about, or when it's referenced about Paul seeing Jesus, especially here in this situation here. Like I said, we're not sure if this is a physical appearance by Jesus or if this was another vision similar to what we talked about in, well, what Paul mentioned in his speech earlier in chapter 22. Then, so Paul's taken off to safety, but there's more danger to come, as the situation typically goes for Paul. Verse 12. When it was day, the Jews made a plot and bound themselves by an oath neither to eat nor drink till they had killed Paul. There were more than 40 who made this conspiracy. They went to the chief priests and elders and said, "We have strictly bound ourselves by an oath to taste no food until we have killed Paul. Now therefore you, along with the council, give notice to the tribune to bring him down to you, as though you were going to determine his case more exactly. And we are ready to kill him before he comes near." So this latest plot that we've got here going against Paul is that there are 40 Jews who have taken an oath and swear not to eat or drink anything until Paul is dead. And this is basically going to happen. They're plotting this as Paul is going from the tribune back to the council. They know that there are some of these chief priests and elders that they can convince to go along with this plot. So that's why they put this into motion here, so that they can tell the tribune, oh, hey, we want to examine him further. We want to discuss things more. And then these 40 men are going to ambush him and kill him as he's going to the council, so they can just get rid of him. So sneaky little plot going on here. And then notice here who comes to his rescue, verse 16. Now the son of Paul's sister heard of their ambush, so he went and entered the barracks and told Paul. Paul called one of the centurions and said, "Take this young man to the tribune, for he has something to tell him." So he took him and brought him to the tribune and said, "Paul, the prisoner, called me and asked me to bring this young man to you, as he has something to say to you." The tribune took him by the hand, and going aside, asked him privately, "What is it that you have to tell me?" And he said, "The Jews have agreed to ask you to bring Paul down to the council tomorrow, as though they were going to inquire somewhat more closely about him. But do not be persuaded by them, for more than 40 of their men are lying in ambush for him, who have bound themselves by an oath neither to eat nor drink till they have killed him. And now they are ready, waiting for your consent." So the tribune dismissed the young man, charging him, "Tell no one that you have informed me of these things."
Yeah,
So,
as far as I could tell, that's only one of two places where Paul's personal family is alluded to in the Bible. Sister and a nephew here, but in the last chapter of the book of Romans, he asked that they would greet a number of people, and included among those my kinsman. Greet my kinsman Herodian. I don't know what kind of how they were related, but evidently he was some relationship. So it's just kind of interesting. You don't think of Paul's family very often,
right?
You know that he had brothers and sisters and nieces and nephews, but
Right.
There's a couple places where that's referred to.
Yeah. Yeah, I was thinking that too as I was getting ready for this. It's like, gee, I don't remember ever hearing anything else about Paul's family, whether reading in Acts or any other places. So, yeah. And it's interesting that Paul's nephew is the one who comes to his rescue, and he's the one who saves Paul from this plot that the Jews have got going on here. And notice a couple times here they reference him as young man. This means he's probably somewhere between the ages of 20 and 40, but we're not exactly sure on his age here. My commentary wanted to exactly say he was 20, but I'm not necessarily wanting to stick an actual age on him if we're not totally sure. So he could be anywhere in that ballpark. It's interesting that when the tribune allows Paul's nephew to speak to him, it's mentioned here in verse 19 that the tribune took him, Paul's nephew, by the hand, and going aside asked him privately all that. So he's literally pulling Paul's nephew aside to talk with him about what's going on. And the tribune knows, he's well aware of what these Jews are capable of. He's seen Paul getting in all these scrapes already. So he's well aware of what the Jews can do and that this is a feasible plot. So he believes Paul's nephew, and so then he makes, so we'll see in just a little bit here how he keeps Paul safe from this. And it's interesting because at this particular moment, Paul's status as a Roman citizen is more important than his status as a Jew. That's how it looks.
Yeah, I answered that a little different. Paul's status as a Roman citizen is more important than his status, I put, as a prisoner. But as a Jew, you know, that would work too. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would definitely agree with you as well. And something we should not, however, be led to believe is that Rome suddenly cares about Paul's mission, of his mission of spreading the gospel.
Yep.
Only about his citizenship.
Right.
So we see how these Roman officials are making sure that Paul is kept safe and that he's kept alive. But it's not necessarily because of what he's doing. It's simply because of who he is as a Roman citizen.
Can you think of the other time that Paul pulled that citizenship business? That was his ace in the hole.
Yeah.
Remember in the book of Acts where he was in prison in Philippi?
Philippi, yep.
And he was singing, and there was an earthquake, but in that story too, I think that's in Acts 16 or someplace. Mm-hmm. They were going to beat him, and then he brought up that he was a citizen, and boy, they backed off real quick.
Oh yeah. Yep, they got pretty scared, and I remember they just wanted him out of there as soon as possible. Yep, so Paul's pretty good about bringing up that whole thing about him being a Roman citizen and how they really can't touch him. Excuse me. All right, so then moving on to verse 23. Then he called two of the centurions and said, "Get ready 200 soldiers with 70 horsemen and 200 spearmen to go as far as Caesarea at the 3rd hour of the night. Also provide mounts for Paul to ride and bring him safely to Felix, the governor." And he wrote a letter to this effect. "Claudius Lysias, to his excellency, the governor Felix, greetings. This man was seized by the Jews and was about to be killed by them when I came upon them with the soldiers and rescued him, having learned that he was a Roman citizen. And desiring to know the charge for which they were accusing him, I brought him down to their council. I found that he was being accused about questions of their law, but charged with nothing deserving death or imprisonment. And when it was disclosed to me that there would be a plot against the man, I sent him to you at once, ordering his accusers also to state before you what they have against him." So notice this nice little letter that Lysias is sending on to Felix here. He's laid out all of what is going on, why Paul is being sent to him. Notice he leaves a couple things out. One of them is his doing, but also the second one is something that he would not have any knowledge about. The first thing he leaves out, notice how in verse 27, he says that Paul was seized by the Jews and was about to be killed by them when I came upon them with the soldiers and rescued him, having learned that he was a Roman citizen. Notice how very nice and how he chalks it all up to the fact that he rescued Paul and he did this great thing. Remember what the actual truth is. he was about to have Paul flogged and then discovered he was a Roman citizen and was like, oops. So he deliberately leaves out some of the finer details there to make him still look good to the governor and to Rome.
Yeah, your handout says that there are two details he leaves out. I agree with that one you just mentioned. That's one I came up with also, but I couldn't come up with a second one.
Right, right. Well, the second one that that he leaves out of here, like I said, that's one that he does not have any knowledge about. And that is the original charge that has brought Paul over to him in the first place. Remember that he does not know why these Jews are so gung-ho ready to kill him, ready to kill Paul. Even right as they arrested him and were bringing him up. Because remember, the original thing that got Paul into this mess is that he was accused of bringing a Gentile into the temple. So like I said, maybe a little bit of a stretch here because Lysias has no idea of why the Jews are going against Paul in this matter. But
I don't think that's a stretch. I think you're 100% correct. He said nothing about the charges. I think that's it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So then verse 31, the soldiers, according to their instructions, took Paul and brought him by night to Antipatris. Time's going. And on the next day they returned to the barracks, letting the horsemen go on with him. When they had come to Caesarea and delivered the letter to the governor, they presented Paul also before him. On reading the letter, he asked what province he was from. When he learned that he was from Cilicia, he said, I will give you a hearing when your accusers arrive. And he commanded him to be guarded in Herod's praetorium. So Felix is shown the letter and Paul is brought before him. And then Felix keeps Paul in safety in Herod's praetorium until the Jews can arrive there. And Caesarea, just to kind of list this out here, is that it is about 55 miles away from Jerusalem. And this place, Antipatris, I believe I read that is about the halfway point or halfway, 3/4 point away in between Jerusalem and Caesarea. So the soldiers brought Paul up to this point, and then they felt that it was safe enough for Paul to keep going without such a large need for guarding him to this extent. And a note about Felix, he was the governor of Judea from AD 52 to AD 60, and he was also known to be cruel. I found that kind of interesting when I read that. It's like, okay, so Paul is not going before some nice guys here.
This actually, this Felix had the same office that Pontius Pilate had.
Mm.
The real headquarters for Pontius Pilate and Felix and Festus was in Caesarea, a city along the Mediterranean. But Pilate happened to be in Jerusalem when Jesus was accused, of his crimes. They often spent time in Jerusalem, but their real headquarters was in Caesarea.
Okay. Excellent. Thank you. All right, so I'm gonna go ahead and stop there. Then we'll continue on next time with chapter 24 and Paul before Felix in Caesarea. So any last questions or comments before we wrap it up for the night?
None here.
All right.
Well, the only thing that I can't really figure out, Paul had this kind of ace in the hole, to say I'm a Roman citizen. It got him out of trouble on several occasions. But according to what we know, we don't know exactly from history, but we think he was executed by the Romans.
Right.
That he was executed possibly by beheading. So there was a point later in his life where that really didn't do him any good, that he was a Roman citizen.
Mm-hmm.
But of course, the powers that be had changed in Rome, and they ended up starting to persecute all Christians. So
Right. Yeah, I was wondering about that as I was reading through this here. It's like, so what we know with church tradition, like you mentioned, and all that, when did that card start to not be a thing that was recognized anymore in Rome? Yeah, so. I'm surprised how quickly we are approaching the end of the book here.
okay. You talked about 3 different Ananiases
Yeah.
in this book. That one that restored his sight after he was converted to Christianity,
Mm-hmm.
He had predicted a lot of this stuff that happened to Paul. He said that he would be persecuted,
Mm-hmm.
and he would have to appear before governments that would hate him and so forth. And so from day one, Paul knew what his life was going to be about. That didn't make it any easier, but it did happen. So.
Yep. Very true. And it's something he kind of alludes to when earlier in chapter 20, they're trying to get Paul to not go to Jerusalem because they know what's coming. He doesn't necessarily allude to it directly, but he knows what's going to happen. He knows that he's going to face the persecution anywhere he goes. So, and he knows that he wants to go to Jerusalem, so he still goes. So I think we're gonna end the meeting there. Barb, Pastor, thank you so much for joining me tonight. God
Sure.
be with you both.
Take care.
I'll see you Sunday.
Yeah, good.